In a world where survival is ruled by the gun, Jack Reynolds made one fateful decision. He gave his last bullet to a dying stranger named Wyatt, a former lawman on the run from a deadly gang. The ruthless leader, Victor Dodd, betrayed Wyatt and thought he could escape justice. But Jack's unexpected act of mercy set off a chain of events that turned the tide. By dawn, the storm of revenge had come, and the reckoning was swift. Justice was finally served, and the price of kindness had never been so clear. Jack Reynolds had always believed that the world was built on a man's strength, his grit, and his willingness to fight when the time came. He wasn't a man of many words, just a quiet cowboy with a worn-out hat, calloused hands, and a reputation carved into the unforgiving land he roamed. His life had been defined by the barrel of a gun, the cold stare of his eyes, and the certainty that no matter what came at him, he'd never back down. But that evening, when the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, Jack felt a pull in his chest, something different from the usual fire of survival. The wind carried the scent of dust and sweat as he rode his horse down the dirt road leading into town. It was then that he saw the figure. At first he thought it was just another drifter, someone in need of a handout or a drink. But as he got closer, Jack saw the blood. A man, ragged and bent, lying half-conscious at the edge of town. He wasn't just tired or thirsty. He was hurt, badly. Blood soaking his shirt, staining the dirt beneath him. A cough rattled his chest, echoing in the stillness of the evening. Without thinking, Jack dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He knelt beside the man, his sharp eyes scanning the stranger. The man was in rough shape, his face gaunt, but his eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone who had given up. No, these were the eyes of a fighter, a man who'd been through hell and was barely holding on. "You're a long way from any town, friend," Jack said, his voice rough but steady. The stranger coughed again, his breath shallow, but he managed a weak smile. "Looks like I'm a long way from anything at all." Jack studied him, recognizing the weight in his words. This wasn't some careless wanderer. This was a man with a story, one written in scars and regrets. He could feel it in the air, the tension between them, a sense that fate had somehow brought them together for a reason. "Name's Wyatt," the man rasped, his voice cracking like dry wood. Jack nodded, feeling the heat of the moment settle deep in his chest. He could see the fear in Wyatt's eyes now, not of death, but of something else. It was the look of a man on the run, running from something darker than just a gang or a bounty. Jack didn't ask questions. Some things didn't need to be said. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the cool metal of his revolver. 6 shots, but there was only one left. He had been saving it, just in case. The thought of using it didn't even cross his mind. Instead, he pulled it out slowly, his fingers brushing the smooth handle, and handed it to Wyatt. Wyatt's eyes locked onto the gun, disbelief flickering in his gaze. "What's this?" "Your last chance," Jack said, his voice low. "You might need it more than me." There was a long silence between them, the kind that spoke volumes. Wyatt didn't take the gun at first. He just stared at it, then back at Jack. Jack could feel the weight of the choice hanging between them, the gravity of it pressing down on both of them like the heat of the desert sun. "You don't know what I've done," Wyatt muttered, his voice barely a whisper, more to himself than to Jack. Jack didn't answer. There were no words for things like that. He had his own demons, his own past, and they both knew that sometimes silence said more than anything else could. He only nodded slightly, a small gesture that said, "I don't need to know." Wyatt's hand shook as he took the gun, but there was something else in his grip, a sense of resolve, a spark that hadn't been there before. He looked Jack in the eyes, as if he was trying to figure him out, but Jack was too steady, too unmoving. After a moment, Wyatt gave a small nod, acknowledging the gesture. "You're not what I expected," Wyatt said, his voice softer now. Jack didn't respond. He stood up and gave a small tug on the reins of his horse, ready to ride off, to leave the stranger to his fate. But something told him he wouldn't be riding alone for much longer. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, or whatever it was that made men cross paths at the right time. Wyatt wasn't just any stranger. He was a man who would change the course of things to come. As Jack turned his back to walk away, the setting sun bathed the world in fiery gold, casting long shadows across the land. The last bullet was now in Wyatt's hands, and in this world, that was enough to change everything. Jack didn't know how or why, but something told him that giving that man his last bullet wasn't just an act of charity. It was the beginning of something, for better or for worse. And as the wind kicked up the dust around them, Jack felt that shift inside him again. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like the first breath of a coming storm. The moment the sun sank behind the jagged hills, painting the sky with streaks of fiery red and orange, Jack Reynolds felt a deep regret settle in his gut. He had given Wyatt his last bullet, a choice made in the heat of the moment, a moment when something deeper than instinct had guided him. But now, as the shadows grew long and the cool desert air bit at his skin, Jack wondered if that single act of kindness would cost him everything. Wyatt had left in search of safety, and Jack didn't doubt that the man would do whatever he could to survive. But survival wasn't the only thing Wyatt would be after. Revenge, it seemed, was the fire that burned inside him, a fire that could only be fed by blood. And Jack knew that once the gang realized their old ally had betrayed them, there would be no mercy. By midnight, the storm Jack had sensed finally hit. A dozen riders, their figures dark and menacing against the starless sky, thundered into town like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Dust and hooves shook the earth beneath them. Guns were drawn, and the air was thick with the crackle of tension. There would be no negotiations, no words exchanged, only violence. The town had no chance. The tavern windows shattered with the first shots. A man who tried to run was gunned down in the street. People scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The gang moved with a brutal precision, cutting down anyone in their path, leaving nothing but chaos in their wake. Jack, his gun long emptied, was among the first to be caught. He fought back with fists, teeth, and everything he could summon, but it didn't matter. Soon enough, he found himself on his knees in the dirt, the cold barrel of a revolver pressed against the back of his head. Then he heard a voice, one he would have recognized anywhere, one that still carried a heavy weight, even after all these years. Victor Dodd, the leader of the gang, the man Jack had once called a friend. Victor's footsteps were slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Jack didn't raise his head. He didn't beg. There was no point. He had known this day would come, and no matter how many times he'd fought, no matter how many times he'd survived, there were some things a man couldn't outrun. Victor stood in front of him, his boots digging into the dirt. His grin spread across his face, wide and triumphant, as though he'd already won. "Did you really think you could run from this, Jack?" Victor sneered. "Did you really think I'd forget?" Jack didn't flinch. He had no words left, no defiance to offer. Just one thing. "Wyatt," Jack muttered, his voice rough. The gang fell silent for a moment, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. Victor's grin faltered. His eyes flickered to the shadows where a figure had appeared, still as a ghost, calm as death. Wyatt. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to send a ripple through the gang. His eyes locked on Jack's, cold, focused. There was no question in those eyes, no uncertainty, no hesitation, only a silent promise, vengeance. The gang laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Wyatt's gaze never wavered. He wasn't there for a fight. He was there to settle something deeper. As the laughter died down, a shift occurred. Something primal, something dangerous. The gang's confidence wavered, and for a moment, just a moment, they felt the weight of the moment. The same weight Jack had felt when he handed Wyatt that last bullet. The price of kindness was coming due. Victor Dodd took a step back, his grin replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Jack could feel the tension thickening the air, every second stretching out into eternity. But Wyatt wasn't the only one with a score to settle. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, not from fear, but from a sudden understanding. Wyatt wasn't alone in his desire for justice. The land they had walked, the lives they had taken, the choices they had made, it was all coming to a head. Victor wasn't going to get out of this easily. Jack couldn't move, but he could still watch, still wait, and something told him that tonight wasn't going to end with the usual bloodshed. No, tonight, it would be different. As Wyatt raised his gun, Jack felt the weight of his own choices, of his own debts. The past had a way of coming back no matter how far you ran, and for all the blood that had been spilled, there would be a reckoning. A new price had to be paid, and this time, Jack wasn't sure who would be collecting it. The first rays of dawn broke over the town like a blade through darkness, painting the sky with hues of red and orange. The silence of the early morning was shattered by the steady rhythm of hooves, a sound that grew louder and louder, like the beating of a war drum. The town, battered and broken, seemed to hold its breath. Jack Reynolds could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his gamble resting heavily on his chest. He had given Wyatt his last bullet, knowing that it might be the only hope they had. But what Jack hadn't expected was what followed: the cavalry. In the distance, the thunder of hooves grew into a full-fledged roar, 1,000 feet pounding the earth in unison. The dust kicked up in waves, and the sharp sound of men shouting to one another reached Jack's ears. The Rangers were coming. And not just a handful, but 300 strong, their horses charging in a sea of dust and steel. Wyatt had been more than just a man on the run. He had been the harbinger of something bigger, something far more dangerous than the gang that had terrorized the land. Behind him were the Rangers, led by a man Jack knew all too well. Former allies, friends even. The Rangers wore their badges with pride, their uniforms gleaming in the morning light, their faces set with grim determination. They were here to deliver justice, and they would not stop until every last one of Victor Dodd's men was held accountable. The gang, those who had just moments ago stood tall and proud, their laughter still echoing in the streets, faltered. Victor Dodd, who had once held the power of the town in his hands, could now only stare wide-eyed at the approaching tide of law and order. Fear spread through the ranks of the gang like wildfire. The bravado, the cocky grins, and the taunts faded away, replaced by the cold, sickening realization that they were no longer in control. The reckoning had come, and it had come with an army. As the Rangers rode up to the gates of the town, they spread out, their disciplined movements forming an impenetrable line of authority. The sun's first light glinted off the polished badges, signaling that they were here not just for a fight, but for a reckoning. They had come for justice, and they weren't going to stop until it was done. Victor's men barely had time to react. In their panic, they fumbled for their guns, but they were too slow. The Rangers moved like a storm, their guns drawn, their orders clear. In seconds, the gang was overwhelmed. It was over before it had really begun. Jack watched, his breath steady and even, as Victor Dodd and his men were taken into custody. The sound of clanking handcuffs filled the air, the scent of dust and gunpowder lingering as the Rangers swarmed the gang. There was no resistance. There was no escape. Jack stood in the middle of the chaos, his mind a blur. He felt the weight of everything he had done, everything that had led to this moment. For all the blood that had been spilled, for all the choices that had been made, there was now peace. There was no more fight to be had. He had been right. Wyatt wasn't alone. And in the end, Jack knew that the cost of kindness had been high, but it had been worth it. The Rangers had come, and with them, they brought not just justice, but a sense of closure to a town that had been hanging on the edge for too long. Jack glanced over at Wyatt, who stood by his side, his eyes still cold but filled with something more now. A quiet gratitude, perhaps, or a promise fulfilled. The two men didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. The job was done. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jack Reynolds allowed himself to breathe. Relief. It washed over him in waves, cleansing the dirt and the weight of the past. The world wasn't perfect, but in this moment it was as close to right as it could be. The sun was up, the town was safe, and justice had been served, and for Jack that was enough. The dust of the battle hung heavy in the air as Jack Reynolds stood tall, watching the last of Victor Dodd's gang being hauled away. The sound of boots scraping the earth, retreating in unison, slowly faded into a solemn silence. The town was quiet now, the noise of the battle gone, replaced by the hum of the morning breeze. Jack felt the weight of it all, the toll the past few days had taken on him, but something else too, a sense of finality. He turned to Wyatt, who stood a few paces away, his face unreadable, his body still tense. Wyatt had stayed behind after the Rangers had taken control. There was no rush to leave. No one spoke, and neither of them needed to. The silence was enough. Finally, Wyatt broke it. "Why help me?" Wyatt's voice was quiet but sharp. "Why give up your last bullet?" Jack didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He'd already made his choice, and there was no second-guessing it now. "Because I didn't want you to die on my watch," Jack said. His words were simple, but there was something in the way he said them, something that carried the weight of years of experience. The choices he'd made, the fights he'd fought, they all led to this moment. He hadn't been willing to let a man die on his terms, not when there was a chance to change things. Wyatt stood still for a moment, his gaze holding Jack's. The sun rose higher in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and orange, but for a long moment, neither man moved. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding. Wyatt's eyes flickered, a shadow of recognition crossing his face. "You didn't just save my life," Wyatt said, his voice steady now. "You gave me a chance to make things right." Jack's jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of peace, maybe. A glimmer of hope. He gave Wyatt a long look, and then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack smiled. A slow, honest smile. He hadn't smiled in so long. Not for himself, not for anyone. But now? Now he didn't feel so alone. Maybe it had been a bullet. Maybe it had been an act of mercy. But in that moment, Jack realized that what he'd done wasn't just about saving one life. It was about giving someone else the chance to choose a different path, the chance to do things differently. He'd given Wyatt that chance, and in return, Wyatt had given him something too, the realization that even the most hardened of men could still find redemption. A man wasn't defined by his past, not entirely. The world was full of second chances, if you were willing to take them. Wyatt nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if he understood exactly what Jack meant. They didn't need to say more. Words weren't necessary. Their actions had spoken louder than any conversation could. As the sun climbed higher, Jack let out a long breath. The weight of everything he had done, everything he had lost, seemed to lift, just a little. The heaviness that had weighed on his chest for so long began to fade. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter now, and that was enough. Jack had done his part, he had made his choice, and in doing so, he had changed not just Wyatt's fate, but his own as well. The bullet that had once seemed like the last thread of hope had become the catalyst for something much bigger. It had been a chance for both men to change, to rebuild, to find something better. The legacy of a man wasn't just in what he took from the world, but in what he gave back. Jack had given Wyatt a chance, and in the end, that was the kind of man Jack wanted to be remembered as. Not the one who lived by the gun, but the one who lived by the choices he made. And with that, Jack Reynolds allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: peace.